Hello everybody, it's the Alco Diesel guy with a long overdue review for you. This is of the Rapido M420. Incidentally, the model in real life is the successor to the Alco C420, which unfortunately went out of production in 1969 when the company folded. As you can see, it has all the traditional Rapido style packaging with a very thick and durable box. Feels almost like a really valuable precious item, even more so than what Atlas sells. That's something I have to give Rapido credit to the way they box their items up. But then again, you pay for this considering how high the price is. I'll get more into that later on as we go. The box again definitely does feel substantial, as I found it very challenging to actually open. Despite having a tripod and having both hands, it took a lot of effort to get the thing apart. This certainly does imply confidence, especially considering how much money was spent on this model and considering all the fine details put into it. We note the French language badge, which is understandable considering this locomotive's Canadian origin, that indicates the locomotive is equipped with sound. The reason why I bring this up is that the sound on this locomotive was a bit of a controversy. You see, this was to be the first Rapido model that was to be equipped with the TCS sound system, or train control systems. I've had good luck with this system now, after several years of owning them myself and being somewhat indifferent and dissatisfied and or underwhelmed by them. But as I've owned those locomotives and equipped with those sound systems, and as I've gotten used to them, I have to admit the system has grown on me. I love the automatic momentum, such as when a train is going up a grade, for example, it will automatically up throttle as if the engineer is running the train to simulate the engine fighting the grade, and a lot of other nice little features, including a very realistic momentum setting, and of course the incredible Keep Alive technology. At any rate, this locomotive was supposed to have that technology installed. Unfortunately, it appears that when this was announced, that there was a lot of pushback from the model railroad community. And many people were saying they would buy the engine with sound, but basically pull the decoder and replace it with a Loc sound decoder, which is the type decoder Rapido has always used for its own custom sound effects since the company essentially started getting into DCC and sound at its inception. Rapido eventually relented on the situation, giving an official explanation as to the fact that apparently getting the TCS decoders from America up to Canada was proving to be a challenge due to the pandemic. I find this explanation personally very interesting, as everything was supposed to be difficult to get back and forth between all countries, especially Europe. And it's interesting that the solution was, and the reason why I bring up Europe, was to go with the European-built Loc sound decoders instead of the TCS decoders. Whatever the case, that's what the company went with, and these decoders are now equipped with a more generic Loc sound effect that basically can be found off the website from Loc sound itself, and not the custom recorded M420 sounds they were supposed to install on these. Or at least that's what it sounds like to me from my ear. We'll get more into that later on. Upon opening the box, we get the usual, and I quote, propaganda material, as I call all this, to remind you of what a wonderful purchase you've made, and it needs to be here considering the expense of buying one of these locomotives. I'll get into the price later on. We get the usual obligatory exploded parts diagram and maintenance instructions, and for a locomotive like this quality that Rapido makes, this is really necessary, not just for the mechanics, which are very difficult in themselves to work with, in my opinion, in terms of disassembling the locomotive, at least for their more recent models, but also in terms of dealing with all the little detail parts that are put in place. We also get the operating manual, which really looks like something, as others have pointed out, that one would have received if they were training to operate this locomotive in real life and not a model. And it really is kind of that, as it is very detailed and gives you pretty much every possible point you might need to operate this locomotive. It is all again in dual language, French as well as English. Okay, I won't keep you waiting any longer. Let's get this locomotive out of its box. As is common with all Rapido locomotives, the locomotive is cocooned in a plastic shell, which is in turn surrounded by a lot of thick foam packaging to ensure the locomotive arrives safe. We carefully remove the cocoon itself so we can unpack the locomotive. Again, it's held in place with a tab on the very top there on the left, which you'll see me release in a second to gain access to the actual locomotive. But first we need to remove the outer plastic skin that actually holds this cocoon together to ensure nothing moves out of its position during shipping. And now we come to the quote-unquote XXX rated portion of this video, aka porn for model railroaders, as I carefully unsheen this locomotive from its protective cocoon and survey the magnificence that is the Rapido M420. And just look at it. The unique Canadian design bell, which is placed over the nose for weather-related issues to ensure it won't be frozen by ice, as I understand, as well as the horn, are well represented. Another nice little detail right next to the actual number boards themselves are the classification lights, and yes, they can each be illuminated with the utilization of a DCC system, and each has its own separate color. This is typical of Rapido's obsessive compulsiveness toward detail and is much, much appreciated. In addition, the grab irons are in perfect location, as are the windshield wipers, and of course that nose door, which does in fact open. Along with the razor straight CN logo and the beautifully color-matched red paint on the nose, as well as the black and white striping. We also note in the trucks, in addition, the unique zero-weight transfer trucks are very well represented. This is again typical of Rapido's higher-end image of being obsessive-compulsive about every last little detail being represented just the way it's supposed to be. Another nice, if not expected, detail is the fact that the actual sand hoses that connect the actual sanding system to the locomotive itself are actually physically connected. The hoses are physically joined to the actual body and run down to the trucks, to where the sand actual ejectors are located right in front of the wheels for traction. Again, another almost required detailing effect that this company is known for. And as with most Rapido products as of late, the couplers have been painted to physically resemble being very rusty. Another nice touch by Rapido. Unusual omission is the lack of underbody detail in the locomotive beyond the actual hoses for the sanding lines, etc. This is again something that made the company famous when it designed its coaches back in the day. We also note the ice skate antenna on top of the cab. The rear of the locomotive is more of the same, and again that's a good thing. All the grab irons are in place, as well as the rear headlight. The lettering is sharp, and the faded red paint really looks sharp as well. The classification lights are in place. Again, I believe these can also be controlled by a command via the DCC controller on your DCC system, but only from that as far as I know. And the prominent CN logo noodle lettering looks sharp as well. Again, Rapido did a great job on both sides of this locomotive in terms of the painting. The white stripes and black paint do not intersect each other and do not bleed into each other, I should say. And they both look of high contrast as well as definition. Another item thrown inside the box is a detailing kit to help detail your M420 to a specific area you'd like it to be in, with window extensions and other minor details available to be installed. I usually don't bother with these, as I find I'm not very good at fitting them and or installing them. I'm not very good with working with glue, and I like to avoid it whenever possible. Nonetheless, they are there for those of you hardcore modelers that like those details, and something that's almost expected from a company like Rapido, again with its obsession with getting all the details just right. This pan shot of the roof of the locomotive shows off the extreme detail Rapido put into the model, including the smokestack and rear radiators. Here's a nice shot of the actual nose of the locomotive itself, as well as the headlight, which incidentally does cast out a very good beam. We'll see more of that later on. Interesting note on this particular cab itself, there is no actual lighting for the actual control stand as with models in the past made by Rapido, as noted by the screenshot of the function commands in the actual user manual now on the right of your screen. Now let's review a few of these. Yes, that was in fact the Doppler horn. I couldn't get the actual regular horn to function for the time being. The air dryer. The startup sequence. And I must mention the distinct Canadian-style bell. And of course, the previously mentioned classification lights. These can be triggered by pressing function 11 on your DCC control system. Now let's focus on this locomotive's prime mover sound, specifically the 251C Canadian variant of the 251 prime mover, and its turbo and supercharging effects. Yes, that smooth, distinctive Canadian variant of the 251 12-cylinder prime mover with its unique turbocharging and supercharging whine. I must also note, in sharp contrast to some other Rapido engines I've gotten in the past, and particularly the RS-11, this locomotive was nice and loud right out of the box, with the speaker system seeming more than up to the task of producing some beautiful sound effects. Speaking of which, listen closely as the locomotive throttles back and we get that beautiful sound of the supercharger winding down, and then spooling back up again. Another positive detail I'd like to point out thus far in this review, at least, is this locomotive's ability to track and or stay on the tracks. If you remember my RS-11 review, that particular Rapido locomotive constantly found every chance to derail. This one, however, proved, at least to this point of my review, to be very reliable. And with the break-in run completed, let's bring this M420 into Midville Yard and give her a real test, hauling a long cut of container cars up Whitestone Mountain to Whitestone Yard. Note, all transfer freights running from Midville Yard to Whitestone Yard must pass the switch to the Whitestone branch to access Whitestone Mountain. This is to keep the locomotive on the correct side of the train to facilitate switching, as the Whitestone Yard area does not have through tracks. Freight trains bound for Whitestone Yard must also stop at the signal and request permission to actually enter the yard itself. permission granted, the train proceeds into the yard. I must say, at this point I was highly impressed with the locomotive's pushing and pulling power, not to mention its tracking ability. But then... the rear truck of the locomotive derailed. Assuming this is a fluke, I decided to reset the train and give us another shot. And again, as we see, it did it again. With the wheels back on the track, the locomotive had no trouble pushing the train into Whitestone Yard. Nonetheless, I still was curious as to why it kept derailing at that point. Was this a case of the Rapido engines again finding every chance to derail? And sure enough, it would happen again.
That's off the track again. Oh, come on. What piece of...
What was that superstition? Lightning never strikes twice? Thinking it was the load of cars that was trying to push up the mountain causing the problem, I decided to run the locomotive light, this is to say without any cars, to see if that would make a difference.
I love that. Again. You gotta be kidding me.
And as you can see, that little thump was the rear wheels jumping the track yet again. So very clearly the load of the cars had nothing to do with it. The locomotive clearly has a tracking issue.
Yep. Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. Oh, I never finished that.
Changing the locomotive's direction seemed to initially help things.
Again, ugh. Seriously?
Interestingly enough, I then found that the locomotive would go into one of my other signings on my Stone Mountain, but just not the one I actually brought the cut of cars into. Strange. I then tried pushing a smaller cut of shorter cars up the mountain. Unfortunately, the results weren't much different.
And it's off again. Oh, what a piece of junk.
I also noted the locomotive started making a strange squealing noise as it operated at this point, and continued to derail.
Oh, come on. It's off the track again.
And these derailment problems would continue on the opposite side of the trestle. Pardon the footage at this point, but I did not want to damage the locomotive, especially considering how hard these are to come by. More on that later.
Again, it's off the track. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. I might back to where I started from again.
To confirm my suspicions that the problem was with the actual locomotive and not the tracks, I decided to give a locomotive that always gave me a challenge up until more recent time a shot at the mountain to confirm that this was in fact the problem, which is this Atherin Alco PA, which I rebuilt a few years back. The reason again why this engine now is able to make consistent and reliable runs up this mountain is thanks to some heavy reworking of the track, including upgrading the tracks to 22 inches, reworking the curves and making sure those curves, especially around the gradients, are properly supported to avoid any unwanted derailments by this locomotive specifically. And as we can see, the engine made it up the hill without any problems whatsoever. Furthermore, it was able to complete the loop and arrive safely down to the second track without derailing on the other part of the trestle whatsoever. Determined and otherwise hell-bent on getting this locomotive up Whitestone Mountain, I decided to try one little trick I hadn't tried before to see if that would make a difference.
And there she is, no derailment. Ah. Okay, let me show you what I found here. It didn't entirely solve the problem, but it did make it much better. I noticed it kept happening right here on this section of track where I have this fancy support, this heavy faux concrete support thing in place. And what I noticed is this had a little bit too much flex in it, so what I did to get around it is I simply put another piece of wood underneath it to jack it up a bit, and that seems to have corrected the problem. The track is now a little bit bent up here this way, I noticed too, so I may have to work on this. Still, all of my other engines made it up here without a problem. This is the only engine to ever have an issue, and it's only a 4-axle engine, and these are known to be much more tolerant of minor things like that. So, at least I'm glad I was able to fix it to make it work, but still, why this thing can't tolerate something a cheaper locomotive can, I don't understand. Whatever the case, time to get this thing back down to the main station and finish this review.
While this MacGyverish bodge I did on the trestle allowed the train to finally get up the mountain, it didn't do anything for the descent portion of the trestle. So very clearly something is still not quite right here.
A little bit too fast. Don't like to do that. That should be good. Should. One of those cars evidently needs lubricating. Squeaking a bit. Blow for the station. Use the automatic whistle thing.
Now let's see how this locomotive tolerates the Midville Yard 15-inch curves located behind my engine house. Note, I am aware that this locomotive was designed for 18 inches and up. That said, considering all the trouble I had with the trestle on this locomotive, I was curious as to see what it would make of this tight curve. And so, as we see, the locomotive had no trouble negotiating the tight 15-inch curves despite all of the issues it gave me going up the mountain. And with the break-in/running-in time complete, let's see how well this locomotive can crawl. Please note the crawl test was performed much like all the rest of the tests that I performed on this locomotive without the factory settings being changed. The locomotive is as it was out of the box. No changes were made whatsoever to the internal DCC programming. All that said, the crawl was pretty respectable, if not a little jerky. It appears there's a high spot in the motor itself. Interesting as these coreless motors that Rapido introduced were supposed to eliminate these problems and apparently make the locomotives they produce, in fact, far more reliable. And now we've reached the point in this review where it's time to discuss the price of this locomotive. Well, that proved actually a bigger challenge than one would expect. You see, I expected to log onto Rapido's website and find an actual listing for the locomotive, but as we can see from this screenshot, there is no listing for the M420 currently on the website as of the time I'm making this review. Interesting. After a Google search, however, I was able to get the original product pricing up, and as we can see, it's pretty steep. $335 US for a DCC and sound equipped variant. Ouch. As for the Canadian dollar price, well, that's $359. The special edition unit with the Royal Canadian logo on it goes for about $10 more on both sides of the currency table. Needless to say, I didn't pay the price that we see listed here for my particular unit with DCC and sound equipped. Mine went for about $279 from trainworld.com. I would have loved to have shown you a screenshot of this price, but unfortunately, it's yet again, these seem to have been pulled from trainworld.com's website, at least temporarily, and or at least as of the time I'm making this film, as I could not find them, and doing a search for it only gave back an error. I did, however, manage to catch a glimpse of the product page from Trainworld before it was apparently removed, or at least temporarily removed, which had a pre-order for the second run of these locomotives. Interesting. Unfortunately, I can't get that link to come up now. Perhaps it was just temporary, but well, we'll just have to wait and see. Another Google search for this locomotive took me back to Rapido's website with an extensive tech support web page made up for this locomotive specifically. It speaks about the squealing and squeaking I noted, which apparently is being caused by the open bearing trucks getting an inadequate amount of lubrication from the factory. It speaks about simply applying a little lubricant to it to fix this problem. Now I can't help but wonder if this somehow was causing the issue I was experiencing getting the locomotive up the mountain, as the bearings themselves not being free enough weren't allowing the trucks and or wheel sets to flex enough to get around the curve as well as climb the grade at the same time. I haven't lubricated my trucks yet, but I'll give this a shot and see if it makes any changes. Another notation made lower down on this particular tech support page refers to an issue with the locomotive responding inadequately to commands put through by a Digitrax system. There's a procedure here, as you can see, outlined to reset that. I haven't tried this yet, but I'll try to make this a priority and give this a shot as soon as possible, and if necessary, update this review, although I really didn't experience much issues in terms of the locomotive's responsiveness throughout the test. To conclude, I really wanted to like this locomotive. I've always had a soft spot for these Canadian-built Alcos from MLW. I always liked the way they looked, the distinctive lights, the bells, the sound effects, everything about them always attracted me to them. That said, I struggled to have the same sort of affection for this particular model due to the minor issues it has, and or major issues it has, including the tracking ability in very strange and weird places. Also, while it's all well and good for Rapido to keep its obsessive-compulsive nature in terms of detailing this locomotive to insane proportions to make it more enjoyable for the ribbon counters to admire as it rolls along on the tracks, it's quite another thing if those detail parts seem to inhibit the locomotive's performance, specifically its tracking ability. I do appreciate all the work Rapido has done in getting the sound effects to work much more effectively on these models, and the clarity of the sound, as you heard on this film, is a definite upgrade. The obsessive-compulsive detailing is also much appreciated. All that said, however, I can't really love this model because of its flaws, and especially considering all the money that was spent. Even though I didn't pay the top sales price for it, I still put a big chunk of cash into this locomotive, and I've bought cheaper engines that ran more reliably than it does currently. Coupled with the disturbing fact that Rapido seems to have pulled the sales page for this locomotive down, makes me feel very uncomfortable, not to mention nervous. Bottom line, at the current time, I can't necessarily recommend this locomotive as a buy right off the bat, especially considering its price. That said, if you are a nut for the M420 like I am, and you really have got to have one, it's hard to beat Rapido's model for its wonderful detailing, its excellent sound effects, and quirky little features built into it. Just be forewarned, you may have to deal with some unfortunate quality control issues that Rapido is still apparently working out. And that's going to do it for this review. If you liked it, please thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe, as that does help me quite a bit. And as always, keep the metal side down.